Hello. In my last video, still under sanction by YouTube by the way, I spoke about what looks like a concerted attempt to erase the history of cinematography, specifically the American part of it. And I just want to make the point that it's entirely in the interests of the present Chinese government to erase American history. And we might remember that as we take a stroll through an architectural disaster. More of that later. First, I have to remember, and I have done, to remind you that it's helpful if you click the like button. And also if you subscribe to my channel, that's extremely useful. On YouTube I'm DemiRep, but on Rumble, BitChute and Minds.com I'm Graniopteryx. I'll scroll my name up here. Okay, now first I want to make a few points about the museum building itself. You see, I'm rather pleased with myself over that because well, actually, perhaps this is the pride that cometh before the fall. But without knowing anything at all about the history of the building, I described it as looking like a giant lipstick tube stuck on the front of an IKEA outlet. IKEA is a big furniture store and household effects store. I think you've probably got them in America as well, haven't you? Anyway, subsequent comments under the video informed me that it was an existing building and that it had been an iconic department store. Well. I'd somehow got the etheric message that the building had been a store, a warehouse of a sort. And perhaps the poor thing was calling out to me to tell me of what awful things had been inflicted upon it. So I just want to mention here the concept of form and function. In 1896, an architect called Louis Sullivan wrote a piece titled, now exactly what was the title? The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered. Okay, and in it he discussed tower blocks, in which he said that the building should have a form that reflects what it does. And he gave rise to the idea that any building can be beautiful if it does what it's supposed to do and doesn't try to be something else. In part, this is what he said, but I do urge you to read the rest of the essay here. I'm trying to call it up. All things in nature have a shape. That is to say, a form, an outward semblance that tells us what they are, and that distinguishes them from ourselves and from each other. And then he said, these shapes express the inner life of the thing. That's like a sort of organic law of nature. And by the way, this is a discussion that turns up in Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead. So, you know, it was much under discussion in the 30s, although this essay was written at the end of the 19th century. Now, I said that the front of the museum was hideous. I did compare it with an IKEA building, but I have to admit that the Lubyanka also sprang into my mind. Those tiny squinty windows on the brutally plain walls, and then this sort of gratuitous massive decoration at the front. I thought it dreadful, but then I was thinking of it as a museum because I didn't know its history. As a department store, it's just fine. It's a bit plain, but it's a warehouse. And at the front, that lipstick is the glamour of the goods inside. And, you know, personally, I'd have said some sort of variation in the walls might have been a little better, but basically, as a department store, I don't have a problem. Now, just as a matter of interest, I will put up some pictures here. They're bound to be some on the internet. It just occurred to me. There are a couple of factories in London where they have prettied up the idea of the factory. For instance, there is the Black Cat factory in near Mornington Crescent, I think, and it capitalises on the 1930s interest, 1920s, 1930s interest in Egyptian things, and of course Egyptian cigarettes, and it was a tobacco factory, so there you are. But if you'll see, it's got huge windows. At least part of it is now a gym, and I know somebody who goes there regularly, and she says it's marvellous, it's just flooded with light. And then there's the Hoover building in Perivale, which is also part of London, and again you see those large windows that reflect the idea it was a factory, so they wanted to take advantage of natural light. So obviously a factory is going to have bigger windows than a department store where you want stuff to be piled up against the walls. But even so, I'm sure they could have done something better with those windows. Anyway, as a department store, okay. I do have a problem with it though as a museum. Its form is now not following its function, because there's nothing in that design that makes anyone think of cinema or the fantasy and the adventure of film and acting and exotic places. There is nothing in that building, in that building's exterior, that gives you that feeling, nothing at all. And so that poor building, pressed into service by a movie industry that obviously doesn't even understand anymore what it is there for, has to suffer being used as a museum. You know, I think it was actually crying out in pain when I looked at the picture. It's a bit like, you know, using that building as a museum is a bit like using a delivery truck as a racing car. You can soup it up all you like, but it's never going to do the job elegantly. Then, and I can't think why, the architects put that giant glass golf ball in the back. First of all, it clashes horrendously with the architecture of the older building. I don't know who the architects are, and frankly, the only reason I would ever seek out their name would be for a company to avoid. Of course, that's just my personal opinion, you know. Which I think I'm still allowed to have. Also, it's quite possible that the architects were dancing to someone else's tune. The donors, for example, or perhaps some Los Angeles suburban planning department. So I don't know who's to blame. And again, it's possible that the architects had in mind that glass pyramid in the front of the French museum, the Louvre, which caused a little controversy at the time, but people did get used to it. I want to point out it rains in Paris. It's a little secret, closely guarded by the French, but it rains almost as much in Paris as it does in London, and the temperatures are only 1 or 2 points above London at any time of the year. What I'm saying is that sort of climate can accept a glass pyramid, because that's not going to heat up fit to explode in the summer. Southern California is another matter. That glass dome, it just has to require an extraordinary amount of air conditioning, and I thought that Californians were into not going in for environmentally wasteful living. And then there's the shape itself. It's a dome, which means it can't be altered, added to, or extended in any way. And Another thing, whereas that French pyramid is stuck in the courtyard of a medieval palace that was rebuilt in the 16th century and then added to in the centuries thereafter, the Wilshire department store is a 1930s deco building which architecturally stands alone. It was never messed around with, that is it. So there's no variety in it the way there is in the Louvre. Do you see the difference? The Louvre pyramid was a solution to the problem of making a more accessible entrance to the building. It had a specific use, which it fulfills. Back to Sullivan again. It reflects the rectangular shape of the courtyard, and it is so different from the rest of the buildings surrounding it that it acts as a sort of foil to them. But Boba Fett's helmet out there in the car park of the department store, it's too close in time to act as a foil, and it doesn't even reflect the shape of the surroundings. Quite honestly, I cannot understand how anyone could think that building was a great idea. But, and now we get back to what I wanted to say. In my last video, I was discussing the disquiet that many people were feeling about the opening of the Academy Museum and the exhibits that marked that opening, because they mostly ignored the early and the crucial part played by America and American companies. But in those early years, movies were a sort of cottage industry, weren't they? I know they had big budgets, and the stars were paid to live a glamorous life and instructed to show that glamour as part of their personas. But even so, apart from some rather generic westerns, and many of them weren't all that generic either, I'm thinking of stuff like Once Upon a Time in the West and Paint Your Wagon, they were all very interesting. Apart from the pot boilers, the films that were made in the early studio system were obviously from a group of people who had pretensions to high art. They did Shakespeare plays, sweeping historical epics, and very tight psychological studies, and they were all, each one, a bit different from the other. Nowadays, many Hollywood films are well polished and slick. They're often sci-fi. They often use industrial assembly line methods to produce a homogeneous product that has all the hallmarks of the sort of mass production that the West is now getting from Chinese companies, from shoes to toasters, from screwdrivers to tractors. Given that Hollywood has more or less sold itself out to investors from that part of the world, to the extent that they don't dare to make movies that contradict Oriental narrative, I suppose we can say that a building dedicated to the selling of mass production consumables is entirely appropriate for an industry that's doing the same thing with its product. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share, share, share.